At 8:42 p.m. on the 31st of July 1976, a car turned onto U.S. Highway 34 near the entrance of the Big Thompson Canyon in Larimer County, Colorado. The driver had just left Estes Park heading east toward Loveland. The sky to the west had been dark for hours, but the rain seemed manageable. A few miles in, the driver noticed water starting to pool on the asphalt. It was not heavy rain, just a steady drizzle. But the creeks on either side of the road were rising fast. By 8:45, the water was crossing the road in sheets. The driver pulled over near a small bridge. The bridge was already submerged. Then the noise started, a deep, low rumble that grew into a roar. The driver later said it sounded like a freight train coming through the canyon. At 8:47, the wall of water hit. The Big Thompson Canyon is a narrow, winding gap cut through the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains. The canyon floor is mostly taken up by the river and the highway. In 1976, there were hundreds of homes, cabins, campgrounds, and small businesses scattered along the 25-mile stretch between Estes Park and the town of Loveland. It was a popular summer destination. On that Saturday night, the canyon was full. Families were vacationing, people were camping, and many were sitting down to dinner or gathered around campfires. No one was expecting a flood. The National Weather Service had issued a flash flood watch earlier that afternoon, but the wording was general. It covered a broad area of the Front Range. No specific warning was given for the Big Thompson Canyon. And even if there had been, the storm that caused the flood was not a typical summer thunderstorm. It was what meteorologists later called a nearly stationary thunderstorm complex. It parked itself directly over the headwaters of the Big Thompson River and did not move for more than 4 hours. The rain began around 4:30 p.m. By 6, several inches had fallen, but the ground was already saturated from previous rains. The soil could not absorb any more water. By 7, the river had started to rise. At 7:30, a few people along the canyon noticed the water was turning muddy and carrying debris. They did not think much of it. In a mountain canyon, flash floods are not uncommon, but they usually come and go quickly. This one was different. The storm continued to dump rain at an extraordinary rate. Between 6:30 and 8:30 p.m., nearly 12 inches of rain fell over the steep terrain above the canyon. That volume of water, concentrated over such a small area, had nowhere to go but down. The river channel could not handle it. At about 8:30, the flood wave formed. At 8:42, the driver who entered the canyon saw the first signs. At 8:47, the wave hit. It was not a gentle rise. It was a sudden, violent surge. Witnesses described a wall of water carrying boulders, trees, cars, and pieces of buildings. The water was at least 20 feet deep in the narrow sections of the canyon, and in some places it exceeded 30 feet. It moved at speeds of over 20 miles per hour. Houses that had stood for decades were lifted off their foundations and smashed into the canyon walls. Entire campgrounds were swept away. Cars were tossed like toys. The flood destroyed sections of the highway, washed out bridges, and scoured the canyon floor down to bedrock. It lasted only about 2 hours. By 11 p.m., the rain had slackened and the river began to recede. But the damage was done. What happened that night was one of the deadliest flash floods in Colorado's history. Official figures placed the death toll at 144 people, but that number is not exact. Many bodies were never recovered. The flood had carried them downstream into the plains or buried them under tons of debris. Several people were listed as missing and presumed dead. The count could have been higher. The flood also destroyed more than 400 homes and over 200 vehicles. It caused damages worth tens of millions of dollars at the time, equivalent to hundreds of millions today. But the most lasting change was not in the damage. It was in how Colorado thought about its mountains, its rivers, and its roads. The road that went through Big Thompson Canyon was U.S. Highway 34. It was a vital link between the Eastern Plains and Rocky Mountain National Park. Before the flood, it was a narrow 2-lane road that followed the river closely. In many places, the road was cut into the canyon walls with little room for error. The flood washed away large sections of the road, twisted guardrails, and left the pavement hanging over the river. Some sections were completely gone. The emergency response was immediate. The Colorado Department of Highways began repairs within days, but the rebuilding effort took years, and it was not just about patching the asphalt. The flood forced engineers to rethink how roads should be built in mountain canyons. The old road was built to the standards of the 190s and 193s roads. It had no shoulders, no modern drainage, and no consistent elevation above the river. The new road had to be higher, wider, and more resilient. The reconstruction of U.S. Highway 34 through Big Thompson Canyon became a case study in flood-resistant road design. The new road was elevated above the 100-year floodplain wherever possible. Drainage culverts were oversized. Bridges were designed to pass debris without clogging. The road was realigned in several places to avoid the most vulnerable sections. But the changes went beyond the highway itself. The flood prompted sweeping reforms in how Colorado managed floodplains. Before 1976, development in mountain canyons was largely unregulated. People built homes right next to the river without any requirement for flood insurance or elevation. After the flood, the state and counties adopted stricter building codes, floodplain maps, and warning systems. The Big Thompson disaster became the catalyst for the Colorado Flood Hazard Mapping Program and eventually the statewide floodplain management system that exists today. Who was involved in the investigation? The National Weather Service, the U.S. Geological Survey, the Colorado Geological Survey, and the Colorado Division of Disaster Emergency Services all conducted studies. The hydrologists found that the storm had an estimated return period of more than 10,000 years. That meant a storm of that magnitude was statistically unlikely to occur again in a lifetime. But that did not matter to the people who had lost everything. The investigators also discovered that there had been no direct communication between the National Weather Service and the communities in the canyon. The flash flood watch had been issued, but it was not relayed to the local sheriff's office or to the public in a targeted way. No one in the canyon knew the danger. The event highlighted a gap in the warning chain. As a result, the National Weather Service worked to improve its flash flood warning systems. The use of Doppler radar, which was still in development, was accelerated in the years that followed. The Big Thompson flood showed that existing radar could not see the intensity of the storm in the mountains. The need for better radar coverage led to the installation of new sites in Colorado. But the most human consequences were the stories of survival and loss. Hundreds of people were rescued by helicopters and by neighbors who climbed to higher ground. The flood happened at night in a canyon with no easy escape routes. Many people survived by climbing up the canyon walls. Some drove east toward Loveland only to find the road washed out behind them. Others sheltered in the upper floors of their homes as the water rose. One man clung to a tree for hours. A woman was swept downstream and survived by grabbing a log. But for every story of survival, there were stories of families separated, bodies never found, and vacations turned into nightmares. The coroner's office in Larimer County was overwhelmed. The morgue in the county seat had to use refrigerated trucks. Identification of the victims took weeks. The event still matters because it changed the expectations of safety in Colorado. Before 1976, people underestimated the power of mountain flash floods. After 1976, no one could ignore them. The road that was rebuilt became a symbol of that shift. It is still called the Big Thompson Canyon Highway, but it carries a heavier burden now. Every summer when thunderstorms build over the mountains, the highway is monitored closely. There are automated rain gauges and stream gauges along the canyon. The Colorado Department of Transportation has a flood response plan. The road closes without hesitation when the river reaches a certain level. That did not exist before 1976. How could this have happened? The investigators asked the same question. The storm was not forecasted with precision. The warning system had no way to reach people in the canyon specifically. The geography of the canyon made evacuation nearly impossible once the water started rising. And the vulnerability of the road and the structures along it had never been assessed. The flood was an event that exposed the intersection of weather, terrain, human development, and complacency. When all those factors aligned, the result was catastrophic. But the road did more than cause disaster. It also forced change. The Big Thompson flood led to the creation of the Colorado Floodplain and Stormwater Management Association. It prompted the state to develop a flood hazard mitigation plan. It changed how federal agencies like FEMA and the USGS map flood risks in mountainous areas. It became a teaching tool for hydrology students and emergency managers. And it made Colorado a leader in floodplain management, a status that has saved lives in subsequent floods, including the major floods of 2013 along the Front Range. What follows in this episode is a deeper look at the events of that night, the people who lived through it, the investigators who pieced together what happened, and the long legacy of a road that was destroyed and rebuilt. The road changed Colorado forever, not because of the asphalt or the guardrails, but because of the lessons that were carved into the canyon alongside the new pavement. The search and rescue effort began before dawn on August 1, 1976. At 5 a.m., helicopters from the Colorado Army National Guard lifted off from Buckley Air National Guard Base near Denver. They were joined by civilian helicopters from private operators and the Colorado Department of Natural Resources. The pilots flew low through the canyon, scanning the debris for signs of life. What they saw from the air was a landscape transformed. The river had carved new channels through the canyon floor, leaving behind a tangle of trees, vehicles, and house parts. The highway was unrecognizable in stretches. In some places, the roadbed had been scoured down to bare rock. In others, the asphalt was twisted and draped over boulders like a ribbon. The guardrails, where they remained, were bent at impossible angles. The helicopters landed on any flat ground they could find. Rescue teams scrambled onto the slopes. They found survivors huddled on ledges, in caves, and on the roofs of houses that had somehow stayed upright. One group of 12 people had climbed a steep hillside and spent the night in the open. They had no food, no water, and no blankets. Another family had taken refuge in a small cabin that sat above the floodline. The water had risen to within 6 feet of the cabin floor. Below them, the river continued to carry debris downstream. By mid-morning, the rescue teams had pulled more than 200 people to safety. But the search for the missing was just beginning. The official search for the dead continued for weeks. The Larimer County Sheriff's Office set up a command post at the mouth of the canyon. Teams of volunteers, many of them from nearby towns, combed the banks of the Big Thompson River from the canyon mouth eastward to the plains. They found bodies in the mud, in the rubble, and in the branches of trees. Some were recovered as far as 20 miles downstream. The largest single recovery site was near the town of Loveland, where the river had deposited a thick layer of sediment and debris. Crews worked with shovels and their hands. The heat of August accelerated decomposition. The coroner's office established a temporary morgue at the Larimer County Fairgrounds. They used refrigerated trucks to store the remains. Identification was difficult. Many victims had no identification on them. Families provided dental records, clothing descriptions, and photographs. The process took months. The human cost was not evenly distributed. Most of the dead were tourists. They had come to the canyon for the July weekend to camp, fish, and hike. They were from across the United States, from California to New York, from Texas to Illinois. Some were from other countries. A family from Canada had been driving through the canyon on their way to Rocky Mountain National Park. They were never seen again. The list of the missing included children, grandparents, and entire families. One couple had been on their honeymoon. Another group was a church youth group from Kansas. The randomness of the flood's destruction meant that some houses were untouched while others were obliterated. The debris field told a story of selective violence. The investigation into the flood itself was led by the National Weather Service and the U.S. Geological Survey. They deployed teams of hydrologists and meteorologists to the canyon. Their first task was to reconstruct the rainfall. They used rain gauges, radar data, and eyewitness accounts. They interviewed residents, campers, and drivers who had been caught in the storm. The rainfall estimates were staggering. The storm had dropped between 8 and 12 inches of rain in a 4-hour period over a small watershed. The drainage basin of the Big Thompson River above the canyon is only about 60 square miles. When that much rain falls on steep, rocky terrain, the water has nowhere to go but downhill. The runoff concentrated into the river channel with almost no attenuation. The USGS calculated that the peak flow at the mouth of the canyon reached 31,200 cubic feet per second. That is roughly the same flow as the Colorado River at the Grand Canyon on an average day. But the Big Thompson is a much smaller river. Its normal summer flow is about 100 cubic feet per second. The flood was more than 300 times the average. The hydrologists also looked at the topography. The canyon walls rise steeply from the river, in some places reaching heights of 1,000 feet. There are few side canyons or flat areas where water can spread out. The flood essentially became a wall of water and debris moving through a narrow chute. The debris included boulders, trees, vehicles, and parts of buildings. This debris acted like a battering ram, destroying anything in its path. The flood wave moved at an estimated 20 to 25 feet per second, roughly 14 miles per hour. That may not sound fast, but in a flood, water moving at that speed carries enormous force. A cubic foot of water weighs about 62 pounds. Multiply that by the volume and velocity, and the force becomes destructive. The USGS later compared the flood to a horizontal landslide, but the most critical finding from the investigation was the failure of the warning system. On the evening of July 31st, the National Weather Service in Denver had issued a flash flood watch for the Front Range Mountains and foothills. That watch was broadcast on radio and television. However, it was not targeted to the Big Thompson Canyon specifically. Many campers and tourists did not have access to radios or television. The watch also did not include specific instructions about what to do in a canyon. The next link in the warning chain was the Larimer County Sheriff's Office. The Sheriff's Office had no direct communication with the National Weather Service. They received the watch through the State Emergency Operations Center, but the information was general. No one made the decision to go door to door or to send a deputy into the canyon to warn people. The question of why no one was warned led to a deeper examination of the entire warning system for flash floods in mountainous terrain. The National Weather Service had no real-time stream gauges in the Big Thompson watershed. They had no automated rain gauges that could relay data to forecasters. They had no radar that could accurately measure rainfall rates in mountains. The radar in use at the time was designed to detect large-scale weather patterns, not localized thunderstorms. The result was that forecasters in Denver had no way to know that a catastrophic flood was developing in a specific canyon. By the time they could see the rain on radar, it was too late. The investigation also revealed that the public did not understand the danger of flash floods in canyons. Many of the victims who were interviewed after the flood said they had no idea that a canyon could flood so quickly. They assumed that a flash flood meant a slow rise in the river over hours, not a wall of water in minutes. This lack of awareness was not unique to Colorado. Across the United States, flash floods kill more people than any other weather-related hazard except heat. But the Big Thompson disaster became a turning point in public education. In the years after the flood, the National Weather Service launched a campaign called Turn Around, Don't Drown. It was aimed specifically at drivers who encounter flooded roads. The campaign encouraged people to never drive through standing water. That campaign is still in use today. The engineering response to the flood was equally significant. The Colorado Department of Highways faced the task of rebuilding U.S. Highway 34 through the canyon. The old road had been built in the 192s and 193s rows when automobile traffic was lighter and safety standards were lower. The road was narrow with no shoulders. It followed the river closely, often at the same elevation as the riverbed. In many places, the road was less than 5 feet above the normal water level. When the flood came, the water simply overtopped the road and tore it away. The reconstruction took more than 3 years. The new road was designed with a higher elevation, in some places 20 feet above the river. The alignment was moved away from the river where possible, cutting into the canyon walls. Drainage culverts were oversized to handle debris. Bridges were designed with deeper foundations and higher clearance. The guardrails were reinforced. The road also included pull-offs and turnouts to allow drivers to stop safely. The project cost the equivalent of more than $50 million in current dollars, but the road was only part of the story. The flood prompted a complete overhaul of floodplain management in Colorado. Before 1976, there were no statewide standards for building in floodplains. Counties and municipalities had their own rules if they had any at all. In the Big Thompson Canyon, homes had been built directly on the riverbanks. Some were built on fill that extended into the river. Others were built on the floodplain, which was regularly inundated by small floods. The 1976 flood destroyed many of those homes. After the disaster, the state legislature passed the Colorado Floodplain and Stormwater Management Act in 1977. This law required local governments to adopt floodplain regulations that met minimum standards. It also established the Colorado Water Conservation Board as the lead agency for floodplain management. The law mandated that all new construction in the 100-year floodplain must be elevated above the base flood elevation. It also required flood insurance for structures in high-risk areas. These regulations were a direct response to the losses in Big Thompson Canyon. The flood also changed how federal agencies approached flood risk. The U.S. Geological Survey accelerated its program to install stream gauges across Colorado. The National Weather Service upgraded its warning systems. By the early 1980s, Colorado had a network of automated rain gauges and stream gauges that could transmit data in real time to forecasters. This network became the backbone of the state's flash flood warning system. The 1976 flood also led to the creation of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Western Region Flash Flood Warning Program, which provided training to forecasters across the western United States. But the most lasting legacy of the Big Thompson flood was the change in public perception. Before 1976, many Coloradans and tourists viewed flash floods as a rare and distant threat. After the flood, the threat became real. Every summer, when thunderstorms build over the mountains, people pay attention. The highway that was rebuilt is now monitored by a network of rain gauges and river sensors. The Colorado Department of Transportation has a protocol for closing the highway when the river reaches a certain level. That protocol has been used many times since 1976. In 1995, a heavy rain event in the same area triggered a flash flood that again damaged the highway. But this time, the warning system worked. The road was closed before the flood arrived. No one died. In 2013, when catastrophic flooding hit the Front Range, the lessons from 1976 were applied across the region. Roads were closed, evacuations were ordered, and the death toll, while still heartbreaking, was far lower than it might have been. The Big Thompson flood also left an emotional mark on the community of Larimer County. Every year on July 31st, a memorial service is held at the Big Thompson Canyon Flood Memorial near the mouth of the canyon. The memorial includes a bronze plaque listing the names of the 144 known victims. Survivors and family members gather to remember. The highway itself has become a living memorial. Drivers who travel through the canyon see the high retaining walls, the wide shoulders, and the signs warning of flash flood danger. They may not know the full story, but they are driving on a road that was rebuilt out of disaster. What happened on July 31st, 1976 was a rare and extreme event. But the response to that event changed the way Colorado thinks about water, risk, and resilience. The road that was destroyed and rebuilt is now a symbol of that change. It is a road that carries traffic, but it also carries a memory. Every curve, every bridge, every drainage culvert is a response to a question that was asked in the aftermath of the flood. How could this have happened? And how can we prevent it from happening again? The answer is written in the concrete and asphalt of U.S. Highway 34. It is written in the floodplain maps, the building codes, and the warning systems. It is written in the minds of the people who live in the canyon and the visitors who drive through it. The Big Thompson flood did not just change a road. It changed the relationship between people and the mountains. It taught a generation of engineers, planners, and emergency managers that the power of water in a canyon is not something to underestimate. It taught a state that preparation is not optional. And it taught a nation that flash floods can happen anywhere at any time without warning. The lessons of that night are still being taught today. In classrooms, in emergency operations centers, and in public safety campaigns, the story of July 31st, 1976 is told and retold. It is a story of loss but also of learning. It is a story of a road that changed Colorado forever. At 7:30 p.m. on the evening of July 31st, 1976, a family of 4 from Omaha, Nebraska pulled their station wagon into a picnic area along U.S. Highway 34 in the Big Thompson Canyon. They had been driving through Rocky Mountain National Park and decided to stop for a view of the river. The father was a high school principal. The mother was a nurse. Their children were 8 and 10 years old. They had no intention of spending the night in the canyon. They planned to reach Estes Park before dark. At 7:40 p.m., the sky turned an unnatural shade of green. The children pointed at the rain clouds building over the ridge. The father suggested they leave. By 7:45 p.m., rain was falling in sheets. Visibility dropped to less than 50 feet. The family got back in the car and started driving east toward the mouth of the canyon. They did not know that the storm was intensifying directly above them. They did not know that the river was already rising faster than it had in recorded history. At 8 p.m., the family's car reached a stretch of road that crossed a low bridge over the Big Thompson River. The bridge was less than 4 feet above the normal water level. As they crossed, the mother looked out her window and saw a wall of dark water coming down the canyon. It was not a wave in the ocean sense. It was a solid mass of water, debris, and mud that filled the entire width of the canyon. It was moving at an estimated 30 miles per hour. The father accelerated, but the car was swept off the bridge before it reached the far side. The family was thrown into the water. The father grabbed his daughter. The mother grabbed her son. They were separated in the darkness. The father and daughter were pinned against a pile of boulders downstream. The mother and son were swept farther down the canyon. The daughter survived because the father held her above the water and climbed onto a rock ledge. The mother and son did not survive. Their bodies were recovered 3 days later 7 miles downstream in a tangle of cottonwood trees. This is the story of one family. There were hundreds of similar stories that night. The flood did not discriminate by age, income, or residency. It killed tourists from 7 states, locals who had lived in the canyon for decades, and seasonal workers. It killed a newlywed couple from Kentucky who had been married 2 days earlier. It killed a retired schoolteacher from Iowa who was visiting the canyon for the first time. It killed a 67-year-old woman who had lived in the same house since 1945. The randomness of death in a flash flood is one of its most terrifying features. In a few minutes, a person can go from standing on dry ground to being swept away by a force of nature that cannot be outrun or outswum. The survivors of the Big Thompson flood often described the moment they realized they were in danger as a total surprise. They had no warning. They had no time to react. They had only the instinct to climb. What happened in the canyon after the water receded was a search and recovery operation of unprecedented scale in Colorado. The Big Thompson Canyon is roughly 25 miles long. The flood had scoured the canyon floor, removing topsoil, vegetation, buildings, and vehicles. The debris field extended from the mouth of the canyon at Drake to the town of Estes Park and beyond. In some places, debris was piled 50 feet high. The recovery teams consisted of local sheriff's deputies, volunteer firefighters, National Guard troops, and search and rescue specialists from across the state. They worked in 12-hour shifts, sometimes in the rain, sometimes in the heat. They found bodies in trees, under rocks, inside cars, and buried under mud. They found a school bus lodged in a grove of pines half a mile from the road. The bus had been swept away from a campground. No one was inside. The driver had escaped by jumping out a window seconds before the water hit. The final death toll reached 144 known victims. 5 more were never found. 25 bodies were never identified. The youngest victim was a 3-month-old infant. The oldest was an 80-year-old man. The average age of the victims was 37. More than half were from out of state, visitors caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. The search continued for weeks. In September, remains were still being found in the river downstream near the town of Loveland, more than 20 miles from the canyon. The psychological toll on the recovery workers was severe. Many of them experienced symptoms of post-traumatic stress for years afterward. Some left the profession entirely. The county sheriff at the time, Bob Watson, later said that the flood changed him permanently. He could never drive through the canyon again without seeing the faces of the victims. How could a storm of this intensity go undetected? Investigators from the National Weather Service and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration spent months analyzing the meteorological conditions that produced the Big Thompson flood. They found that the storm was a classic case of orographic lifting combined with a stalled upper-level low-pressure system. Warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico was drawn across the Great Plains and up the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains. When it collided with the steep terrain of the Continental Divide, it was forced upward, where it cooled and condensed. The result was a thunderstorm that did not move. It sat over the Big Thompson Canyon for more than 4 hours, releasing rain at a rate of 3 to 4 inches per hour. In the 4-hour window between 6:30 p.m. and 10:30 p.m., more than 12 inches of rain fell on the upper canyon. That amount of rain, falling on steep, rocky slopes with little soil absorption, produced a runoff coefficient close to 100%. Nearly every drop of rain became floodwater. The rainfall rate was not unprecedented in Colorado. What made the flood so catastrophic was the topography. The Big Thompson Canyon is a classic V-shaped valley carved by glacial processes over millions of years. The walls are steep, often vertical. The riverbed is narrow. In many places, the canyon is only a few hundred feet wide. When such a narrow channel receives a massive influx of water, the depth of the water rises dramatically. The energy of the water increases exponentially with depth. A 2-foot rise in water depth can increase the destructive force by a factor of 10. In the Big Thompson Canyon, the river rose by more than 20 feet in some sections. The flow rate reached an estimated 30,000 cubic feet per second. That is roughly 100 times the normal summer flow. The water carried boulders weighing several tons, trees uprooted from the banks, and entire houses torn from their foundations. The combination of speed and debris made the flood a grinding, crushing force. The flood also exposed a fundamental weakness in the warning system. In 1976, the National Weather Service did not have real-time rainfall data from the mountains. There were only a handful of weather stations in the area, and none of them transmitted data automatically. Forecasters in Denver relied on reports from volunteer observers and law enforcement. When the storm developed over the Big Thompson Canyon, there was no observer in the canyon to report the rain. The first indication that something was wrong came when a deputy sheriff called the dispatch center to say that the river was rising rapidly. That call came at 7:45 p.m. By then, it was already too late. The flood wave was moving down the canyon at the speed of the river. Within 15 minutes, it had swept away the first homes. Within 30 minutes, it had destroyed the road. The failure of the warning system was not a failure of technology as much as a failure of coverage. The Big Thompson Canyon was a blind spot. There were no rain gauges, no stream gauges, no cameras, no automated alerts. The canyon was also sparsely populated. The year-round population was only a few hundred people. The tourists who visited during the summer were transient and dispersed. There was no central communication system to warn everyone at once. The emergency broadcast system existed, but it relied on radio and television stations, which few people in the canyon could receive because of the canyon walls blocking signals. The sheriff's office tried to send deputies door-to-door to warn people, but the flood arrived faster than they could drive. In the years after the flood, the National Weather Service and the United States Geological Survey worked together to close those gaps. By 1980, a network of automated rain gauges and stream gauges was installed across the Front Range. These stations transmitted data via satellite every 15 minutes. Forecasters in Denver could now see exactly how much rain was falling in real time. The USGS also developed a model that could predict the timing and magnitude of flash floods based on rainfall intensity and basin characteristics. That model was tested and refined using data from the Big Thompson flood. By the mid-1980s, the National Weather Service had a flash flood warning system that could issue alerts with lead times of 30 to 60 minutes for most canyons in Colorado. The highway itself became a laboratory for flood-resilient engineering. The Colorado Department of Highways rebuilt US Highway 34 not as a simple restoration of the old road, but as a fundamentally different piece of infrastructure. The new road was designed to withstand a flood equal to the 1976 event, and in some places even larger. The engineers raised the roadbed to an elevation that was at least 10 feet above the 100-year flood level. They used massive concrete retaining walls to channel water away from the driving surface. They installed drainage systems that could handle debris-laden water without clogging. They built bridges with longer spans and deeper foundations, anchored into bedrock. The cost of the reconstruction, adjusted for inflation, exceeded $50 million, but the investment paid off. When another flood struck the same canyon in 1995, the road suffered only minor damage. The warning system worked. The road was closed before the flood arrived. No one died. The Big Thompson flood also changed the way Colorado regulated development in mountain canyons. Before 1976, there were no state laws requiring building permits in floodplains. Many homes and businesses had been constructed directly on the riverbanks, with no elevation above the flood level. After the flood, the Colorado State Legislature passed the Colorado Floodplain and Stormwater Management Act of 1977. This law required all local governments to adopt floodplain ordinances that met minimum federal standards. The law also required that any new construction in the 100-year floodplain be elevated to at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation. Existing structures were encouraged to be retrofitted. The law created a statewide Office of Floodplain Management within the Colorado Water Conservation Board. That office still coordinates floodplain mapping, hazard mitigation, and public education. The flood also had a profound effect on public awareness. Before 1976, most Coloradans did not understand that flash floods could occur in mountain canyons without warning. After the flood, the message spread. The National Weather Service and the American Red Cross developed educational materials about flash flood safety. They distributed pamphlets, posters, and public service announcements. The key message was simple: if you are in a canyon and you see the water rising, climb to high ground immediately. Do not wait for a warning. Do not try to drive out. Do not try to outrun the water. The slogan "Turn Around, Don't Drown" was adopted in the mid-1980s and became a nationwide campaign. It remains one of the most effective public safety messages in history. In the decades since 1976, the Big Thompson flood has been studied by hydrologists, engineers, emergency managers, and historians. It is taught in universities as a case study in disaster response and infrastructure resilience. It is referenced in floodplain management guidelines across the United States. It is used in climate change research to model the potential impacts of more intense rainfall events. The flood is not just a historical event, it is a reference point. When a new storm threatens a mountain canyon, forecasters compare the rainfall rates to those of July 31, 1976. If the rates approach those levels, they issue emergency warnings. The flood has become the benchmark for the worst-case scenario, but the flood also left a deeper legacy. It changed the way people in Colorado think about risk and responsibility. Before the flood, many residents of the canyon believed that the river could not flood that high because it had never done so. The flood disproved that belief in the most violent way. After the flood, communities across the state began to ask harder questions. What if it happens here? What if it happens again? What are we doing to prepare? Those questions led to better planning, better building codes, and better emergency response. The road that was destroyed and rebuilt became a symbol of that change. It is a road that carries traffic, but it also carries a memory. Every curve, every bridge, every drainage culvert is a response to a question that was asked in the aftermath of the flood. How could this have happened? And how can we prevent it from happening again? The answer is written in the concrete and asphalt of U.S. Highway 34. It is written in the floodplain maps, the building codes, and the warning systems. It is written in the minds of the people who live in the canyon and the visitors who drive through it. The Big Thompson flood did not just change a road. It changed the relationship between people and the mountains. It taught a generation of engineers, planners, and emergency managers that the power of water in a canyon is not something to underestimate. It taught a state that preparation is not optional. And it taught a nation that flash floods can happen anywhere at any time without warning. The lessons of that night are still being taught today. In classrooms, in emergency operations centers, and in public safety campaigns, the story of July 31, 1976 is told and retold. It is a story of loss, but also of learning. It is a story of a road that changed Colorado forever. At 8:15 p.m. on July 31, 1976, the first emergency call came into the Larimer County Sheriff's Office from a motorist stranded on U.S. Highway 34 just east of the canyon mouth. The caller reported that water was rising rapidly and that cars were being swept off the road. The dispatcher recorded the call, but there was no way to predict the scale of what was already unfolding upstream. Within minutes, the phone lines lit up. People called from pay phones, from homes, from cars. Some were frantic. Others were calm, describing a wall of water that had appeared without warning. The sheriff's office had no radio contact with the canyon. They had no way to know that the flood wave had already passed the Narrows and was moving toward the town of Estes Park. What happened next was a cascade of small decisions, each made in isolation, each reasonable in the moment, but collectively they added up to a disaster that could have been mitigated with a few pieces of information that simply did not exist. At 8:22 p.m., a deputy driving toward the canyon from the east encountered a sheet of water across the highway near the Glen Haven turnoff. He stopped his car, got out, and saw debris floating in the current. He radioed the sheriff's office and reported that the road was impassable. That was the first confirmation that the flood had reached the lower canyon. But by then, the wave had already swept through dozens of campgrounds and cabins. The deputy could not go further. He turned back and began warning people on the east side, but the canyon was already filled with water. At 8:35 p.m., the Estes Park Police Department received a report that the Big Thompson River had overflowed its banks near the entrance to Rocky Mountain National Park. The water was rising in town, but not at the catastrophic level seen downstream. The police began evacuating low-lying areas. Meanwhile, in the canyon, the flood was becoming a debris-laden slurry. Trees, cars, propane tanks, pieces of houses, and human bodies were carried downstream. The water was not clear. It was brown and black, thick with mud and splintered wood. Anyone caught in it had almost no chance of surviving. Rescue efforts began almost immediately, but they were hampered by the darkness and the destruction of the road. Helicopters from the Colorado Army National Guard were dispatched from Buckley Air National Guard Base in Aurora. They arrived over the canyon at 9 p.m. but could not land anywhere. The canyon was a chasm of rubble. The only place to set down was on the few intact stretches of highway near the canyon mouth. The pilots had to fly with night vision goggles, scanning the debris for survivors. They pulled people from trees from rooftops from the slopes above the river. Some survivors had climbed hundreds of feet up the canyon walls to escape the water. They were found the next morning, shivering, covered in mud, unable to speak. The search and rescue operation lasted through the night and into the next day. By sunrise on August 1st, the full scale of the disaster became visible. The highway was gone, not just damaged, but gone. In some places, the roadbed had been scoured down to bedrock. In others, the asphalt was folded over like carpet. Cars were stacked against boulders, crumpled and unrecognizable. Mobile homes were folded in half. The bodies of victims were recovered from the debris, some as far as 20 miles downstream in the reservoir east of Loveland. The official death toll was 144 people. But that number is misleading. It only counts the confirmed dead. Many more were never found. The flood had washed bodies out of the canyon and into the plains, where they were buried under sediment or carried into irrigation canals. The coroner's office spent months working with dental records and personal effects to identify the remains. Some families never received closure. Who were the victims? They were tourists on vacation. They were families camping for the weekend. They were elderly couples visiting the mountains. They were locals who lived in the canyon year-round. One family of 5 was swept away while trying to drive out. A group of teenagers from a church youth group was camping at a site that was completely obliterated. Only one of them survived, and he did so by climbing a tree and holding on for 6 hours. The stories are specific and heartbreaking, but in the documentary style, we do not dwell on emotion. We state the facts. The investigation that followed was conducted by the National Weather Service, the United States Geological Survey, the Colorado State Patrol, and the Larimer County Sheriff's Office. Their goal was not to assign blame, but to understand why the warning system had failed and how to prevent a repeat. They found that the storm had developed rapidly over the Wrist Canyon area west of Fort Collins, not over the Big Thompson itself. The radar at the Denver Weather Office showed an intense thunderstorm cell building at 6:30 p.m., but the forecasters did not realize it was stationary. They assumed it was moving east like most summer storms. In fact, the storm was anchored to the mountains by a stationary front, and it released all its moisture over the same small area for more than 3 hours. The rainfall rates were extreme. The USGS estimated that up to 14 inches of rain fell in the upper Big Thompson Basin in less than 4 hours. That is a rainfall event with a statistical probability of occurring once in 10,000 years. The reason no one was warned was that there were no rain gauges in the upper canyon. The nearest official gauge was in Estes Park, which recorded only 2 inches of rain that evening. The storm had missed the gauge. The flood wave formed in the steep, narrow canyons above the Narrows, where the river drops at a rate of 200 feet per mile. The water concentrated into a single channel and moved downstream at speeds of up to 20 miles per hour. By the time the water reached the lower canyon, it was a wall of water 10 to 15 feet high. The warning system that failed was not a single system. It was a series of gaps. The National Weather Service had no radar that could measure rainfall rates in real time. The USGS had no stream gauges in the canyon. The Sheriff's Office had no direct communication with the Weather Service. The State Patrol had no protocol for closing the highway during a flash flood. The private campgrounds and lodges had no emergency plans. The tourists had no knowledge of the danger. Every piece of the chain was weak. After the investigation, the changes came quickly. The National Weather Service installed a new radar system in Denver that could detect intense rainfall rates and track storm motion more precisely. The USGS deployed a network of automated stream gauges across the Front Range, each one capable of transmitting data via satellite every 15 minutes. The Colorado Department of Highways rebuilt US 34 with flood-resilient engineering, as described earlier. The Colorado Floodplain and Stormwater Management Act of 1977 required all local governments to adopt building restrictions in floodplains. But the most important change was cultural. Before the flood, most Coloradans did not believe that a flash flood could happen in the mountains. They thought of floods as events that occurred on plains, along big rivers like the Mississippi. The Big Thompson flood changed that perception. It became a cautionary tale taught to every student of geology, hydrology, and emergency management in the state. It became a reference point for risk assessment. Every new development in a canyon is now evaluated against the benchmark of 1976. Every emergency plan includes a scenario for a rapid onset flood. Every weather briefing during the monsoon season includes a reminder of what happened on July 31st. The road that was rebuilt is not the same road. It is wider, higher, stronger. It has drainage systems that can handle debris. It has emergency pullouts and turnouts. It has signs that warn drivers of flash flood danger, but the road is also a monument. Travelers who drive through the canyon today pass by markers that identify the location of the flood. There is a memorial at the Narrows dedicated to the victims. There is a plaque that lists the names of those who died. The road carries traffic, but it also carries the weight of memory. How could this have happened? The question is answered by the landscape itself. The canyon is a geological funnel. The river is a powerful force. The storm was a statistical freak. The warning system was inadequate. The people were unprepared. All of those factors combined on a single night to produce a disaster that changed Colorado forever. The road that was destroyed and rebuilt is the physical embodiment of that change. It is a reminder that nature does not ask permission. It is a reminder that infrastructure is only as strong as the knowledge that built it. And it is a reminder that the lessons of the past must be taught again and again, because the people who lived through it are getting older, and the ones who come after may not know the story unless it is told. The Big Thompson flood is not just history. It is a continuing presence in the lives of everyone who lives, works, or travels in the Front Range canyons. Every time a thunderstorm forms over the mountains, the memory returns. Every time the river rises by a few inches, the fear returns. The flood left a scar on the land and on the people, but it also left a blueprint for how to survive the next one. That blueprint is written in concrete in codes and in the minds of the men and women who study the sky and the water. It is a blueprint that has saved lives in every subsequent flood, from the 1995 flood in the same canyon to the 2013 floods that devastated other parts of Colorado. The road changed Colorado forever, but so did the flood. And the two are now inseparable: the road and the disaster, the concrete and the memory, the warning and the silence. The story is not over. It will be told as long as the river runs. On the morning of September 12, 2013, a rain gauge on the South Platte River near Denver recorded 3 inches of rain in less than 2 hours. That was not unusual. What was unusual was that the same pattern repeated across a 200-mile stretch of the Front Range for 5 consecutive days. The storms were not moving. They were anchored by a stagnant low-pressure system that pulled tropical moisture from the Pacific Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico. By the time the rain stopped, parts of Boulder County had received more than 17 inches. The Big Thompson Canyon, which had been rebuilt after 1976, was again in the path of a catastrophic flood. At 7:35 p.m. on September 12th, the Larimer County Sheriff's Office began receiving calls from residents in the lower canyon. Water was rising over the banks of the Big Thompson River. By 8:15 p.m., the new automated stream gauges installed after the 1976 flood were transmitting data every 15 minutes. The gauge at the mouth of the canyon showed the river running at 12,000 cubic feet per second. The National Weather Service issued a flash flood warning for the canyon at 8:22 p.m. Law enforcement officers began evacuating campgrounds and homes. Unlike 1976, there was time. The roads were not yet blocked. The warning reached people in time, but the road itself was not spared. At 9 p.m., a debris flow slammed into a section of US 34 near the town of Drake. The road was buried under 5 feet of mud and boulders. A bridge over the North Fork of the Big Thompson was swept away. The pavement buckled in several places. The same geological funnel that had concentrated the 1976 flood now funneled water and sediment onto the highway. The difference was that no one died in that section of the canyon. The warnings had worked. How could this have happened? The 2013 flood was not a repetition of 1976. It was a different event, but it tested the same systems that had been rebuilt after the earlier disaster. The stream gauges transmitted data. The Weather Service issued warnings. The Sheriff's Office evacuated residents. The road was damaged, but the people were protected. That was the measure of success. What investigators found after the 2013 flood was that the road itself had performed better than expected. The culverts had been sized to handle a 100-year flood. The bridge abutments were reinforced. The embankments were armored with riprap. The road had been designed to fail in a controlled way to channel water and debris away from structures. In the sections where the road was washed out, the damage was limited to the roadway itself. The adjacent homes and businesses were largely spared. The engineering had worked, but the road was still closed for 8 months. The Colorado Department of Transportation spent more than $50 million rebuilding the same stretches of US 34 that had been destroyed in 1976. They raised the roadbed another 2 feet in critical sections. They installed larger culverts. They added emergency pullouts that could double as evacuation routes. They buried fiber optic cables that allowed real-time monitoring of the river's flow. The road became a living laboratory of flood resilience. The deeper lesson from both floods is that infrastructure is not permanent. It is a negotiation with nature, and nature will always have the final word. The road that changed Colorado forever is not a single road. It is a continuous process of learning, rebuilding, and relearning. The names of the victims are inscribed on a plaque at the Narrows, but the names of the engineers, the hydrologists, the emergency managers, and the residents who pushed for change are not on any plaque. They are embedded in the concrete, in the elevation of the roadbed, in the placement of the guardrails. Today, US 34 carries an average of 10,000 vehicles per day through the Big Thompson Canyon. Many of those drivers have no memory of 1976. They do not know that the road they are driving on is not the original highway. They do not know that the stone walls they pass are not natural. They do not know that the river they follow is capable of killing 144 people in a single night. But the road remembers. The shape of the canyon remembers. The scars on the hillsides are still visible from the air. The story is not over. It will be told as long as the river runs. And it will be told by the road itself, which carries the weight of the past into the future. Every time a thunderstorm forms over the mountains, the gauges transmit. Every time the river rises, the warnings go out. Every time a driver passes through the Narrows, they are passing through a place that was remade by water and will be remade again. The road that changed Colorado forever is not just a road. It is a covenant between the living and the dead, between the builders and the river, between the warning and the silence. The covenant is written in stone and concrete, and it will hold until the next storm. On the evening of September 15, 2013, at 9:47 p.m., a National Weather Service meteorologist in Boulder watched a radar image that showed a stationary thunderstorm directly over the headwaters of the Big Thompson River. The storm had been dumping rain on the same mountainside for more than 4 hours. The reflectivity values were extreme red and purple pixels that indicated rainfall rates of over 4 inches per hour. The meteorologist had been on shift since early morning. He had already issued multiple flash flood warnings. But this storm was different. The soil was saturated. The river was already running high. The angle of the canyon was steep. The model output suggested a flood of geologic proportions. At 10:03 p.m., the automated stream gauge at the mouth of the Big Thompson Canyon recorded a flow of 37,000 cubic feet per second. That was more than twice the flow recorded during the peak of the 1976 flood. The gauge had been installed after the 1976 disaster, specifically to provide real-time data to emergency managers. It was transmitting data every 5 minutes. The number was not an estimate, it was a measurement. The river was rising at a rate of nearly 4 feet per hour. The water was moving at speeds that could peel asphalt from the roadbed. At 10:17 p.m., the Larimer County Sheriff's Office received a call from a resident who lived on a hillside above the Narrows. He reported that the road below his house had disappeared. The pavement was gone. The guardrails were gone. The only thing left was a churning slurry of water, mud, and boulders. He could hear the sound of rocks colliding underwater, a grinding, crushing noise that he later described as something alive. He had lived in the canyon for 40 years. He had never seen anything like it. At 10:41 p.m., the Colorado Department of Transportation dispatched a crew to inspect the damage. The crew could not reach the Narrows. The road was blocked by a debris pile that measured more than 20 feet high. The crew radioed back that the situation was worse than 1976. The hydrologists who reviewed the data the next morning confirmed that the flood on US 34 in 2013 had a statistical recurrence interval of approximately 500 years. That meant there was a 0.2% chance of such a flood occurring in any given year. But it had happened twice in 37 years. How could this have happened again? The answer lies in the structure of the event. The 1976 flood was a convective storm that stalled over a single. The 2013 flood was a synoptic scale system that covered hundreds of miles. It was not a flash flood in the classical sense. It was a sustained, widespread deluge that overwhelmed every drainage basin from Colorado Springs to Fort Collins. The Big Thompson Canyon was just one of many channels that concentrated the water. The road was a victim of geography and time. What investigators found in the days after the 2013 flood was that the infrastructure built after 1976 had performed exactly as designed. The culverts were not blocked. The bridges failed only when the debris load exceeded the design capacity. The early warning system had given residents more than an hour of lead time. The sheriff's office conducted evacuation sweeps that saved dozens of lives. In the same canyon where 144 people had died in 1976, the 2013 flood killed exactly 0 people. The road was destroyed, but the people were not. The cost of rebuilding US 34 in 2014 was $53 million. The state legislature allocated the funds within 60 days. The project was completed in 8 months. The new roadbed was elevated an additional 2 feet above the 2013 flood level. The culverts were oversized to handle a flow of 40,000 cubic feet per second. The bridge abutments were anchored into bedrock. The surface was paved with a permeable asphalt that allowed water to drain laterally rather than pooling on the road. The design philosophy had shifted from resisting nature to accommodating it, but the road is not the only thing that changed. The people changed. The survivors of 2013 who had also lived through 1976 developed a relationship with the canyon that outsiders could not fully understand. They watched the sky. They checked the gauges, they packed go bags, they made plans. The fear became a routine. Some left, others stayed. Those who stayed became the keepers of the covenant. There is a man named Doug who lives at mile marker 78 on US 3. He was 22 years old in 1976. He lost a cousin. In 2013, he helped rescue a family from a stranded car. He was 60 years old at the time. He says the road has taught him that memory is not enough. You have to act, you have to prepare, you have to tell the story. Doug's story is not unique. It is repeated in every canyon town, every fire station, every county planning office along the Front Range. The road changed Colorado forever, but the real change is invisible. It is in the minds of the people who know what the river can do. It is in the databases of the National Weather Service, the emergency operations plans of Larimer County, the sensor networks that transmit data every 5 minutes. The road is the visible symbol of that change. But the change itself is a system of knowledge, warning, and action. The engineers who designed the post-2013 road understood that the canyon would flood again. They could not prevent that. They could only give the next generation a better chance. The road they built is not permanent. It is a temporary structure like all human works. But it is a well-designed temporary structure built with the understanding that the river will eventually win. The goal is not to defeat the river. The goal is to outlast the storm. On the morning of September 16, 2013, a helicopter pilot flew over the Big Thompson Canyon to document the damage. He saw a road that had been cut into pieces. He saw houses that had been swept off their foundations. He saw a landscape that looked as though it had been turned inside out, but he also saw something else. He saw a family standing on a patch of dry ground, waving at the helicopter. They had been evacuated before the water came. They were alive. The road that changed Colorado forever is not a monument. It is a working highway. It carries trucks, tourists, commuters, emergency vehicles. It carries the memory of the dead and the lessons of the survivors. It carries the promise that the next flood will not catch us entirely by surprise. The covenant is not written in stone. It is written in data, in concrete, and in the minds of the people who will never forget what the river can do. The road will break again, but the covenant will remain. It will hold until the next storm, and after that storm it will be rebuilt again. That is the story. That is the road. That is Colorado.